Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
The General Services Administration, the landlord for much of the federal government, says none of the owned or leased buildings it has data on meet the minimum occupancy standards set by law last year. But GSA is reexamining the data it's collected so far. Among its concerns, the data doesn't differentiate office space from rooms where employees aren't working. Federal News Network's Jory Heckman is here with more detail. Jory, thanks for joining me.
Hey, Terry.
What data does GSA have on its occupancy rates?
Yeah, so this is a first-time thing for GSA under the Use It Act, which former President Joe Biden signed in his last days in office. This is a piece of legislation that requires GSA to collect this data. And this is occupancy data for the 24 largest federal agencies. A couple asterisks there, and we'll get into it. But by and large, this is the first government-wide snapshot of these agencies and how full their federal buildings are. This is data that is collected any number of ways for a lot of buildings, especially in the D.C. area, that's being measured by badge swipes in and out of the building. That's a data point they already had, so they're repurposing that for a rough approximation of occupancy data. And so GSA, earlier this year, they, in March, put out their first draft of this Use It Act database showing where agencies currently are, kind of a snapshot in time of the data. And that's where we are currently with the collection of that data.
What's the mathematical formula here? That's what I'm wondering. How do you actually calculate occupancy rate, and what does the data show?
Right. So what they've been able to do is, in rough terms here, maybe oversimplifying things, but it's kind of the numerator being the number of employees in the building divided by the square footage of the building, and you get some approximation of this amount of space per this amount of employees. And the goal is to get to a minimum 60% maximum occupancy of the building. That's the benchmark under the Use It Act. And if agencies aren't meeting that threshold in their buildings, then the law tells them that they've got to do something about that. They've got to right size their office space. They've got to co-locate, bring other agency tenants into the building, do something to get those numbers up. And so right now, what we've seen with the data snapshot so far is that no federal building that submitted data is meeting that 60% threshold. Some get close. Some are in the 59.5%, just a nose under. But that being said, 60%, 60%. However, we did recently hear from the acting commissioner of GSA's Public Building Service, Andrew Hiller. He told House lawmakers that GSA is going back and taking a closer look at the data that they've collected so far because, as he tells lawmakers, the agency is not necessarily getting an apples-to-apples comparison right now with the data that it has.
The bill, the Use It Act, was really focused on total space. And so you're counting things like auditoriums, conference rooms, libraries, spaces where people shouldn't be reasonably expected to work during a given day.
Jory, you said this was GSA's first attempt to collect the data. So if they're going to go back and sharpen their pencils, how exactly are they going to refine the data?
They're going to go to the Federal Real Property Council that GSA leads. It actually co-leads that with the Office of Management and Budget. And so they've created an occupancy working group to review this very issue. It's front of mind for the Trump administration. It's front of mind for Congress, and has been since 2020 in the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic, when a lot of federal buildings were sitting largely vacant. That was this point of contention that lawmakers certainly were concerned about, saying, why are we paying all this money to maintain buildings that aren't being used? And so, especially now with the Trump administration's push to have federal employees in the office 5 days a week, they're trying to make sure that these buildings are being fully occupied, and if they're not, get rid of them. So this is something that's being brought before that council. They're going to spend some time taking a look at the state of the data, what more they can do to refine that data and make sure it's accurately measuring office space and not non-office space.
This is not a problem that's unique to government buildings. Every kind of office space wants to know their occupancy. Has GSA received any helpful hints from the commercial real estate market?
They did, yeah. So this is all for greater context here. This all was being discussed during a recent roundtable held by members of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. And in that roundtable, we also heard from Tim Hutchins. He's the executive vice president for CBRE. And that company, they've taken a closer look at the state of federal buildings, and based on their study and analysis, they've found that on any given federal building, 65% of the total square footage is office space, and the other 35 is the auditoriums, the libraries, the things that Heller discussed. And so Hutchins, from his perspective, he says that you've got to keep that in mind as you look at the Use It Act data, that 65% of all the total real estate space is office space. And so if you're looking at square footage, it's really tough for agencies to realistically achieve the Use It Act metrics.
So, I think the commissioner has really hit on it. To enforce the Use It Act, you need good data, and good data needs to do two things. It needs to reflect the goals you're trying to achieve, and it has to be consistent.
So what happens next, Jory? Do they just redo the math? Do they have another report that's out? What will happen?
So we'll have to wait and see what the council comes up with, whether GSA kind of put some asterisks or qualifications on the data that is collected so far. One other thing that was interesting was to get the lawmakers' responses to what was being said in response to what Hutchins had to say about 65% of the buildings being office space. Scott Perry, the chairman of the subcommittee that was holding this roundtable, he said, well, if that's the case, then maybe we have to set the bar higher for occupancy. Maybe instead of 60%, we do 80%. That's just an example, something he was throwing out there. Not a hard and fast recommendation, but he said that, certainly the goal here under the Use It Act is making sure these buildings are fully occupied, and that's what he aims to do.
That's Federal News Network's Jory Heckman. Jory, thanks for this update.
Thanks, Terry.
You can find his story at federalnewsnetwork.com.